ILDs in general, as you have shown that it's going to be the major cause, not only in this country, but all over the world, you see. I think we'll have some questions to the panel, and we will be joined by Dr. Zafar Iqbal, who is from Fortis Hospital, both, and Aditya Jindal. Both are also frontline fighters against COVID, especially post-COVID fibrosis, that we are seeing a lot of cases with residual disease, even if fibrosis is not established. And I am sure they will also throw some light on how they diagnose and treat these patients. So can I ask Dr. Zafar, are you with us?
Yes, sir. I just
Yes.
unmuted myself.
Yeah. What is your experience with post-COVID fibrosis?
So we started off with facing COVID much later than Bombay, and last 7 months are the time that we have been actually seeing the COVID patients onslaught. For the last 3 months, we've started seeing our post-COVID follow-ups. Surprisingly, we read a lot about post-COVID fibrosis, and we've been looking out for them. And for that, we've been scheduling the follow-ups initially post-discharge every 15 days, just to screen out those patients of fibrosis. Thankfully, most of our cases are actually showing resolution. Particularly 4 to 6 weeks after the discharge, we are seeing the CT clearances. We are yet to find a full-blown Dr. Zarir type case where we have a typical the honeycombing and advanced fibrosis. Yes, we have lots of patients who have been on who have had severe ARDS on ventilator for some more than 2 weeks and have been discharged, and most of them actually have died. So those patients, yes, we are following them up. We did consider antifibrotics in few of them, but yet, frankly speaking, yet to find the first case with a typical Dr. Zarir type fibrosis.
Okay. Aditya, can you also mention your experience? You see what? Yes.
Yeah, so overall, I would say that I would agree with Dr. Zafar in what he has said. Definitely, our area has experienced the surge in COVID much late. So the fibrotic cases probably are coming in the last 3 months only. And I think I can recall only one case of such a severe fibrosis, which that patient was admitted in a hospital and developed bilateral pneumothorax, and because of the severe fibrosis and the ventilation. So, and but surprisingly, that patient has recovered significantly, is off oxygen, though still limited, has significant dyspnea, but is off oxygen. Saturation is normal. Most of the time, in at least in my experience, and we've been seeing lots of cases of COVID, these people recover very fast. In fact, I'm surprised by the capacity of the lung to repair itself. Conventionally, it is thought that most of the organs in the body do not sort of repair or heal very significantly.
Okay, Dr. Zarir, I think I'll put this question to you. Have you ever considered doing bronchoscopy or biopsy to diagnose fibrosis, post-COVID fibrosis in this patient? I know it is a very kind of risky proposition.
Yeah. I think more than risky, Professor Jindal, I don't think you really need to do it. You have a CT scan these days, and really that is all you need to document the presence of fibrosis and then follow it up as well.
Do you think the indication for antifibrotic drugs would differ on the type of pathological changes which you might see on biopsy?
Again, I would argue that a CT scan showing evidence of traction bronchiectasis and honeycombing is enough of an indication in a person who has had a COVID pneumonia to either follow them up extremely carefully and hope that everything clears, or start antifibrotics at that early stage. And as the results of these two trials come in, and we're all keenly waiting for those, we will get a better idea on what antifibrotics actually do to alter the natural history of post-COVID ARDS.
Okay. Professor Guleria, there is nowadays great talk of the progressive fibrosing illnesses, you see, not only IPF, because a lot of other, the sarcoidosis, hypersensitivity pneumonias also. So all these things, they are being clubbed under one heading, the progressive fibrosing illnesses, which makes the need for doing biopsy even less. You see, I think like Zarir has already said about the post-COVID fibrosis. So how will you treat the other fibrosing illnesses? Do you again go without biopsy and start the antifibrotic drugs in these patients?
I think that concept is basically looking at the pattern on your CT and then deciding whether to treat that pattern with antifibrotics, or if it is showing ground glassing or features which suggest that you may need anti-inflammatory. For example, if you have a UIP pattern, even if it's not IPF, you could still say that should we give antifibrotics. And I think there is now a lot of data emerging that even in the other fibrotic interstitial lung disease, antifibrotics would be useful. Only rider that I would put in place is that you must first make sure that the anti-inflammatory drugs are not working, and it is definitely fibrosis. As has also been mentioned also in COVID-19, something which looks as fibrosis and irreversible sometimes changes dramatically once you see it over a period of time. It may be because of steroids, it may be the natural course of the disease. And therefore, I would say that if you are having a patient upfront, better to, and you know that this is not IPF, but it's just, let's say, a CTT-related ILD or some other, you must try steroids and anti-inflammatory and immunomodulators upfront. If the patient doesn't show any improvement, there is progression, there is definitely a case for a fibrotic ILD getting antifibrotic drugs. This is, I think, something that we've learned over the last few years. It's some sort of a treatment strategy. I'd also like to add here a little bit about our experience as far as COVID-19 and post-COVID fibrosis is concerned. This is a huge challenging area which we need to really explore as to what is the role of different treatment strategies. Currently, it's really unclear. We have a huge burden of disease. In AIIMS, we've now crossed more than 10,000 patients that we've treated with COVID-19, and a large number of them have some degree of post-COVID changes. Not all of them have lung disease, but chronic fatigue syndrome, brain fog, and a lot of other things. And as has been mentioned, there is a difference in how people behave, and it's very difficult to predict that. We have some people who you would repeat CT after 6 weeks with a dramatic clearance. Others really show very, very slow and gradual improvement, but do show a clearance. I have one patient who was on a high flow nasal cannula for 2 months. He went into ICU psychosis. We had a huge problem in managing him. I have now shifted him to the private ward, and now he is on just 2 liters of oxygen. He has come out after almost 8 weeks of gradually tapering off. We put him on a HFNC in the private ward because he was creating such a ruckus in the ICU that we had to shift him out of there. And now he is on 2 liters of oxygen, but he's developed very severe critical illness, polyneuropathy, and has marked wasting of his muscles. So he's on a very aggressive pulmonary rehab program. So how patients behave is something which is very, very difficult to predict. And I do agree with what Zahir said, that we urgently need biomarkers to be able to predict how this disease will behave. There are people who go into rapid pulmonary fibrosis. We've lost a few patients on ECMO while we're trying to shift them for lung transplant. So there is a spectrum of disease that we see, and we're not being able to predict who will behave in which manner. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we have, because we're just currently treating everyone with a cocktail of things: antifibrotics, steroids, other drugs, just hoping that something will work, because it's sort of a desperate situation without any data. So I think we need to really have some sort of data, and I'm hoping in the next few months we will have some clarity in terms of are we doing the right thing or not? That's the basic question that really comes to your mind. Where is the science behind what we're doing? But as far as fibrotic ILDs are concerned, I think yes, there is definitely a role of antifibrotics, even if it's a non-IPF ILD.
If I can make a point, Professor Jindal.
Yes, yes, please.
In patients like Randeep's, one always wonders what the effect of 50, 60 liters flow of oxygen over weeks and months will also have in terms of lung damage and hyperoxia. So we need to factor that in also as a possible potential contributor, if not cause of fibrosis.
Correct. I would agree with that. We have to be very careful about the high flow, high FiO2 that we're giving, and we must try our best to decrease it as much and as early as possible, rather than having the oxygen toxicity coming in. That I think is also something which is another area that we need to look at, because in the beginning, the issue was of trying to sort of save a person's life rather than looking at long-term complications. Now we're sort of looking at the other side of what happens in the long term. And therefore, I think we need to start now re-looking at our initial treatment strategies, as we've done as we've gone along managing COVID-19. That's also an important point.
Why do you think it should be progressive in that sense? You see, once it's a one-time injury, which heals, or in fact leaves a lot of residual fibrosis or other things may leave. But I think, for example, a lot of patients of other viral infections, tuberculosis, of course, tuberculosis has a large experience where there's a lot of fibrosis in the lungs. But progression has never been shown in any of other post-infective fibrosis. So is there any kind of course, we don't know. I think that is, it's too early to predict that, I understand. But you have any idea or any hypothesis, Zarir?
As I stressed, it's not the normal pattern. Let's be upfront and admit that. As Zafar also pointed out, I would say it's the distinct minority of patients who will develop it. But as I said in my first slide, even a distinct minority of 90 million people is still going to end up with hundreds of thousands of patients with fibrotic lung disease. So I do believe the whole history of interstitial lung disease will be rewritten in a sense. And to answer your question on why it's progressive, I guess it's like any acute viral exacerbation worsening ILD and the whole disease tempo just flaring up. It's a bit like that, I would guess. Why it doesn't occur in more patients and only the minority, I can't answer.
So may I just make a point here, sir?
Yeah.
There was one paper which I just reviewed, which talked about mutation, phenotypic changes that happens. Some of these ILDs may have some genetic mutations where telomere shortening happens, and a very small subset of such group of cases who are initially non-progressive may become progressive. So that's one of the suggestions in one of these papers that I've come across. So we might be seeing certain subset of cases, as Dr. Zarir pointed out, where progression also is noted. Majority of the cases that we have come across till now in this part of the country have been those who had shown dramatic clearances, resolution in 6 weeks' time. And we were quite happy with that. Probably that with time, we'll start getting those cases which Dr. Zarir is already facing.
I may also add here, sorry, yeah, Zarir,
I want to stress that these are always the most severe end of the spectrum, the ones with the worst ARDS who require the highest FiO2s and the longest periods of ventilation as well. So in our Breach Candy ICU, for example, ventilation of periods of 3-4 weeks with a tracheostomy is not unheard of, or very common, I would say. And it's that subset of patients who are the ones who are going to be most likely, at least, to get this.
Okay. In fact, I may add here that some time back, I wrote to several of the PJ alumni all over the country and wanted their data on the use of antifibrotic drugs in cases. So we have data from about almost 170 patients, which is not yet analyzed, of course. That is so I can't say, but these are those patients where antifibrotic, either of the two, have been used, you see, and I'm sure we may find some answers, although this data is not according to any definite study plan. That is a big deficiency, I must say that. So,
Yeah.
but I agree with one point that they're used like anything, you see, by people all over the. In fact, we get patients every day where everybody is starting one or the other antifibrotic drug these days.
And Bombay's physicians, if I may, so are extra quick off the mark. So combination of both is fairly routine.
Okay.
And, as Sandeep has pointed out, that these drugs have to be used very, very cautiously in the critically ill setting with their liver and their coagulation interaction.
I think if I may add, because of the fact that we don't have enough data, people have started using them even in mild disease. This is what has happened. What COVID-19 has actually shown us is that there is a lot of, in terms of a pandemic, the rationality of giving drugs has not there. It's even for COVID itself. We'll have people giving tocilizumab on day one, starting with all sorts of combinations in patients who have very mild disease, and even starting antifibrotics even when there is really no need to give it. And therefore, I think there is maybe, I mean, this is just a suggestion. It may be more of an expert opinion rather than evidence-based, that one should come up with some guidelines, I would say, as to what should be done in terms of managing these patients. We may not say that this is evidence-based, but there should be some broad consensus that we develop, because currently a lot of these drugs are being used as like anything. I mean, I hardly see any patient who's been referred, even who has mild COVID, who's not on antifibrotics. Let me just be very frank about it. It seems that everyone is put on one antifibrotic, even if there is a little bit of, say, fibrosis, which is not causing any problem to that patient. It's just a fibrotic scar, which is not really a cause of concern, but he would be on antifibrotics. I'm not sure how to really go about this, because it's just, in my mind, a lot of misuse of drugs where there is really no indication.
True. I'm more often stopping antifibrotics than starting them, to be honest. And at least the patients
Yeah,
refer.
sure. I think a number of these patients suffer from multiple drug toxicities, not only antifibrotics, but the list of drug, if you really read about COVID, may sometimes be more than 10, 10 drugs which have been used. And if you use,
sadly, from the GP level, before they come into hospital to even after they leave, it just goes on. And that's why we're seeing the alarming increases in antibiotic resistance and fungal co-infections.
Yes, yes. I think I will also like to add, there's a lot of talk about the antioxidants and use of spironolactone as antifibrotic drug in COVID patients. Will anyone like to make any comment? Zarir, would you?
I've heard of its use and it has some rationale, I believe, but I've
Yes.
not really considered it, waiting for more data.
Yes,
So
Sandeep, you have any? Yes, yes,
so
Zafar.
it's basically considered because they consider that the ARDS, which occurs in COVID, resembles to something which is related to high altitude pulmonary edema. Some similarities have been drawn, and that's why the drugs spironolactone has been recommended, but has not shown. One of the papers did not advocate its use on a routine basis.
Okay. I think we have some questions from the audience, which I like to put. There is one question that if we administer antifibrotics very early in the disease for patients who have severe hypoxemia, will we not end up treating a very large number of patients with a proportion of whom will recover almost completely? Yes, although I think the question has been addressed early, but can you be more specific on this answer?
Yeah, I agree with the questioner completely, but no one knows which patient is likely to progress. And you don't want to end up being that patient yourself, I guess.
Yeah.
Lack of biomarkers here, lack of early predictor signs you don't have.
Yeah, of course, I don't think we are going to have biomarkers or predictors very soon, you see.
So there are some biomarkers that have been recommended but they are basically recommended through the BAL evaluation, a bronchoalveolar lavage sample, which can be taken in the first week of ARDS. And there they say if you measure certain collagen peptides and fibrocytes and fibroblasts in the bowel sample, you can predict the potential fibrosis that that patient may be posed for. So they are the potential biomarkers being evaluated along with what Dr. Zarir had pointed out.
Okay, one related question is, and fibrosis is evident in patients within 4 weeks of onset. That is those who are going to develop it.
Right.
Would antifibrotics be started on day 4 or 5? Will they have enough time to act by week 4? So the early start.
So if you agree that it would take 1 or 2 months before they start to have their effect, then you could make a good case for starting them earlier rather than later. But again, that would mean in the acute stage when the person is sick with so many other comorbidities and interactions possibly occurring. So the question of timing is also the crucial one.
Yeah, it is very crucial. Unfortunately, we do not know the answers to some of these questions. Is methylene blue beneficial to prevent fibrosis?
In one word, no.
No. Has anybody heard of methylene blue?
No,
Use,
And-
there is. So we do a COVID EICU, which we do twice a week for a large number of hospitals. We've done more than 400 hospitals, and I'll tell you that there are a few hospitals and doctors there swear by methylene blue and said that all our patients of COVID we give methylene blue. I have never been able to tell. I have not been able to understand the logic behind it. There is no basis of giving methylene blue either for COVID or for COVID fibrosis. I would just like to say that.
And similarly, low dose of radiotherapy.
So this is again, if I may add, this is based on 2 papers which came out, which looked at the antibiotic era or after the H1N1 pandemic. There was some data during the 1918 pandemic that low dose radiotherapy may be useful. There are studies which have been done which shows that if you give low dose radiation, you may decrease the viral load in the lungs, and there are studies which have been done. A pilot study was done even at AIIMS because our National Cancer Institute became a COVID hospital. They had a whole radiotherapy setup, and with great difficulty, one of our radiotherapists got ethical clearance to do it. But he has done a small group of patients with mild COVID. But there is a paper from abroad which he had shown to me, which has shown some benefit. I don't think, I think it's still, with all the other treatment strategies available, I don't think this is a good option, honestly.
In any case, radiotherapy can cause fibrosis as well. You see.
For fibrosis.
So that is the thing. Radiation causes fibrosis also. So their argument has always been that the dose that we're using is much lower, and we are now having better machines which can really deliver it in a very good manner, and there will be no risk of fibrosis. I am still very cautious about it, and therefore I would not recommend it.
Okay. How common is mucormycosis as a sinus infection in post-COVID disease? Zarir?
Since you asked, we have a patient currently in our ICU who's developed large cavities in the upper lobe, which I initially took to be aspergillus. We were fooled because the BDG levels were slightly high as well. And eventually when we got the sputum culture, it was steaming with mucor. The cause was undoubtedly her large doses of steroids over the preceding weeks in hospital. And we have her on this new but very expensive drug. I can't quite, voriconazole. It's
Posaconazole, yeah.
Posaconazole.
Posaconazole.
Which costs about $1,20,000 a month. But I'll keep you posted. And there's an editorial by one of my colleagues, Aisha Sunawala in JAPI, with Rajiv Soman, our ID specialist, on mucormycosis in COVID. So it's a fungal infection which is emerging, especially since we have a background high rate in our ICUs.
Yeah, I can understand, right?
Yeah, there was a recent paper in Lancet.
Yes, go ahead, Aditya. Hello? You're not audible.
The Lancet Respiratory Disorders on analyzed almost 35 patients. Name also as a COVID-associated mucus camp or something. It's called a specific term. And they found that especially with steroids and also with tocilizumab, the rates of mucormycosis are high. And people who develop pneumothorax, pneumomediastinum, and cavities, they should be specifically evaluated for mucormycosis in the post, like people who have had COVID first.
So both aspergillosis and mucormycosis is now being reported more and more. I think it's related to the high dose steroids, immunosuppressions these patients get. Many of them get tocilizumab, which also predisposes them to secondary fungal infection and possibly the compromised lung that they have. And many of them may have underlying diabetes, which will also be a risk factor. Therefore, I think this is something we need to really keep out our sort of keep a low threshold for diagnosing, especially in the second part or maybe in the second or week or so after steroids and other drugs have been given. If the person worsens, secondary fungal infection is something that we need to aggressively look for, and that is also becoming a little bit of an issue in the ICUs.
Yeah, I am sure. You see, one will not be really surprised to find all types of infections in these. These are immunocompromised patients, long ICU stay, ventilators, and steroids and other immunotherapies, etc. So I think fungal infections, and soon may have reports about other infections as well. You see, in these patients. Well, I think Reer had covered other points like how many days of antifibrotics is advised in COVID-19, which is better, pirfenidone or nintedanib. There are again questions by the audience. I do not know if you like to add anything about these two questions, or other panelists like to say anything. Sorry.
I think equally effective or ineffective, we don't know. And we just need to monitor very carefully, as we have stressed. How many days someone had asked, again, till you document stability or improvement, unlike IPF where it's lifelong.
How to manage post-COVID refractory pulmonary fibrosis? Again, rehabilitation, perhaps pulmonary rehabilitation, oxygen, and any
supportive
transplantation, I think. Lung transplantation. What is the experience of lung transplantation in these patients in this country? We read in the news, of course, occasionally. Anybody had kind of first-hand experience of transplantation? You told about a patient, but he died before transplantation. You see, yeah. Randeep, you had.
So there have been 2 or 3 patients that have been airlifted. But yes. I know that 2 of them have died before they could get a lung transplant. One was in Hyderabad, the other was in Chennai. Or one patient, I'm not sure whether he got it, what happened post-transplant. So because sometimes you're not able to get in touch with the patient subsequently.
I think the mortality is so high when they're taken in this emergency setting on ECMO, even in the very best centers in the world, that I just dissuade my patients, even the so-called VIPs who can afford it, saying it's quite a futile gesture.
I would tend to agree with that. Currently, I don't think the experience with lung transplant in patients with post-COVID fibrosis, especially in the early phase, is very, very encouraging. But I don't have very strong data to back that up.
I think I am finished with the questions by the audience. If any panelist wants to say anything at the end to the audience as a message, you're welcome, you see.
Just have a point to make, just some food for thought. So if these antifibrotics come out to be useful in, if after the data is analyzed and these are useful in post-COVID fibrosis, would one consider using them in other viral infections or other causes of fibrosis in post-ARDS patients, for example, in the early stages, when the patient is on the ventilator and you are predicting that there might be severe fibrosis after that? So just a point to make.
So what I would like to make it a point here. At our center, what we have been actually practicing in COVID is post-COVID. To look for the post-COVID, we are proactively screening them in our OPDs post-discharge. Not many patients have gone home on antifibrotic, maybe a couple of out of the 1,600 odd patients that we have discharged so far. only 2 or 3 patients have gone on, those who have long stayed more than a month or so in the hospital, and we have definitely demonstrated fibrosis, early signs of fibrosis, especially the traction bronchiectasis and all that. But my concern is the screening part. If we, our practice is basically we screen out them and follow them up for the signs of fibrosis. How often should we actually be doing it? What is the practice in Bombay and at All India Institute, sir? Just for the follow-up thing, how often the CT should be done? At present, we are doing a monthly CT scan in our follow-up in those whom we suspect. If we do not suspect any fibrosis in the follow-up CT, we do not repeat a CT scan. However, where fibrosis is seen, we just follow them up on a monthly basis. So what is the practice at Bombay and Delhi, sir?
So my first follow-up is at 1 month post-discharge. And then if there is still something to follow up in terms of CT and symptoms, then 3 months and 6 months. And we've not gone longer than that really so far, but up to a year for sure. And as I said, yes, I would agree, 90% improve over that period of time.
We would do probably the same thing. We would do a first teleconsultation between 2 weeks to 4 weeks, not only asking for pulmonary manifestation, but for other features that they may have. Many of these patients continue to have chronic persisting cough, which troubles them for a long period of time. So a lot of symptomatic treatment is required. If they have symptoms of worsening breathlessness or other symptoms, we would then call them in for a lung function or a CT scan. And then if need be, a CT scan is usually done after 3 months. It's usually by that time that a significant improvement is observed in most patients. And you are then, if you have patients who have still some degree of changes in the lung, then you will need a long-term follow-up, which could be 6 months or 1 year.
Okay, so obviously there are very exciting times for clinicians and research workers to do work, you see, and answer most of the queries which have been raised. So far, we are just basing our kind of practice on experience. And many times it is just individual experience, you see. So I'm sure we soon will have kind of definite criteria and guidelines to follow. And some research work will also be available from India as well as, of course, from outside India. But with this, I thank all my panelists for sparing time, Dr. Zarir Udwadia, Dr. Guleria, Dr. Zafar, so for staying with us, Dr. So I think they're very busy people. So thank you very much, you see, and thanks all the audience for the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for.
Thank you.
Good night.